I'll introduce myself first and then I'll turn over to our panelists. So my name is Gowri Somasekhar. I'm one of the co-organizers of In Neuro, and I'm also a fifth-year PhD candidate at Duke University School of Medicine, actually co-mentored by Dr. Jarasa here himself. And I'll turn over to you. So can you briefly introduce yourself and describe how you got involved with the African Ancestry Project?
Yeah, so I guess I'll open it up for the team. So I'm actually the last person on our group to get involved, and I get invited to give talks a lot, and so I was up at giving a talk at Hopkins in February. This is back when people used to travel to give talks. And I was up there and I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Weinberger. And, we're sitting in his office and he started giving me a real a lesson on genomics research. I'm a mouse researcher, so I only think about genomics to the extent that I'm mutating them or modifying them in the mice. But he gave me a real lesson on genomics research. It's links to how we were thinking about the next generation of treatments in the precision medicine initiative. And then much to my surprise, I'd always thought about folks of African ancestry being underrepresented in genomics studies. But one of the things he brought my attention to was that the large genomics studies didn't have people of African ancestry in them at all, right? And I don't like to use the word excluded, but because I believe in statistics and data science, it's really hard to figure out how in millions of subjects you sort of randomly don't include folks of African ancestry. But it is a real wake-up lesson for me. And as we were talking, he mentioned, and I'll let my esteemed colleagues tell you more about the history before that, but he mentioned that he and a team were working to do something about this, this absence of research. This is something that's personal for me. I have people in my family with mental illness. And so the idea that these large-scale genomic studies weren't being built on a foundation that applied to me and my family was something that troubled me greatly. And so I knew that some way, somehow I have to be involved. I have incredible roots into Baltimore as well. My family's in Baltimore. I went to undergrad in Baltimore County. My sister's the Baltimore Health Commissioner. So it's just a very natural connection for me to join the initiative. And I'll let my colleagues tell you more about how the initiative came to be and all of the work that they've done before I had the opportunity to lend a little bit of my expertise to the initiative.
Yeah, if I may, my name is Rev Al Hathaway. I'm a Baptist preacher in Baltimore City, the pastor of Union Baptist Church, which is a historic church, 168 years old. And this church has had a tradition. I'm the 10th pastor in that 168-year history. And that church has always had a history of advocacy. We were early on back in terms of 1865, we launched what is now known as Bowie State University, which is the first HBCU in the state of Maryland. And then later on, we took a case to court dealing with the Stewart sisters back in 1883. And that case involved the first real case where there was a ruling of that African Americans, we had Plessy versus Ferguson. So this ruling basically came down and said that persons who were Negroes was not chattel in interstate commerce. And so there's always been from running a congressman in 1968 and then 1970, you have the first African-American congressman going to the 7th Congressional District, Congressman Byron Mitchell. So our church has always been active and involved in the civil rights and human rights movement. So when it came to my attention, and I traveled to the Lieber Institute, talked with Dr. Danny Weinberger and his team to find out that African Americans were underrepresented and maybe possibly even excluded in the area of neuroscience research, it became clearly a sense of advocacy for myself. And I was introduced to it by a dear colleague and friend, Martin Knott, and he brought to me that this is something that needs to be addressed. And so out of that social justice lens, and I began a process of advocacy with Lieber to see, one, how can we make certain that we level the playing field Two, how can we make certain that there are resources for funding in neuroscience research? And the third, which was just as important, was how do we make certain that we have a Afro-centric genomic data set? And so I've been on the advocacy side of this. I have to give it to my scientists. They're the ones who know the nuances of it. But clearly for me, it's a social justice issue of epic proportions, of which me as a faith leader has a responsibility to be involved in.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I
And
guess on the cleanup, I'm sort of the cleanup hitter here. So I'm Dan Weinberger, and I'm the director of this Lieber Institute for Brain Development. I was trained as a medical doctor in neurology, brain disorders, and psychiatry. I worked at the NIH for 3 decades, and I came to Baltimore to create this institute called the Lieber Institute for Brain Development, which was endowed by 2 philanthropic families who had a strong interest in neuropsychiatric illness in their families. And the idea of the institute was to study the brain and to understand how genes and the environment work together to build human brains. And based on genes and the environment, sometimes these developmental trajectories that brains go on across a lifetime deviate from the best adaptations that brains can make, and they have these illnesses. And so in the process of doing this, we as brain scientists realize you can't study brain disease if you don't study the brain. It's sort of a no-brainer. You have to have brains to study brain diseases. So we have teams at the Lieber Institute that work very hard in acquiring donations of human brains from deceased individuals for research. And we collect brains from around the country from 5 different centers, 4 of which are medical examiners' offices, which are brains that happen because of an unexpected death. And these brains are donated by the next of kin, the families, from medical research. And in the process of doing this, over the past 10 years, the Lieber Institute has donations from over 700 families of African ancestry. And having spent 3 decades at NIH, having been trained as a neurologist and a psychiatrist, it was very clear to me that while there were clear differences in disease rates, in resilience and susceptibility across ancestries, all ancestries, whether it's African ancestry, European ancestry, Asian ancestry, these ancestries mattered in terms of how frequent some diseases were and how resilient people were to some diseases. But it was clear that of the 700 plus brains that we had, of individuals that were donated from African ancestry families, this ancestry was profoundly underrepresented in the scientific research to understand brain disease. And because we were very keenly aware of this disparity at the research end, we felt we had to have partners in the community that could help us advance this research effort, which was really very much lacking. And because of connections in Baltimore, we made a connection with Rev Al Hathaway, who really has led the effort to raise funding. We formed a formal partnership with Morgan State University as a formal partner in this. I had the good fortune to convince CAF to join us because he is an extremely influential and powerful voice for raising people's consciousness about the need to recognize ancestry-based differences in human diseases. So I think we've put together a team, and we now have pretty much a first phase project underway to try to reduce some of the disparities that exist in brain research.
thank you for all of your
I could go on.
introduction. So my next question will be, from a scientific perspective, can you actually discuss the differences between pseudosciences such as phrenology? So that is the pseudoscience of taking people's brain or skull measurements, and this was used to justify racism against people of African ancestry, versus things like genetic diversity.
Maybe I can make a word, say a word about
please.
that, but I really would like Kath to speak to this too, because a lot of this has to do with basic neuroscience research, which he is really the expert in. You know, human beings are very diverse species. In fact, all species on this planet are very diverse. Species come in all kinds of varieties. And, you know, everybody has two eyes. Everybody has two hands. Everybody has 2 feet. Everybody has one brain, one nose, etc. These are fundamental features of all human beings. And there's no variation in this. But the fact is, human beings come in very different shapes and sizes, and they have different personalities, and they have different skin color, and they have different eye color, and they have all kinds of divergent properties as a species. If we didn't have these variations, by the way, we never would have made it this far as a species. I mean, I like to remind people, human beings are a pretty physically disadvantaged species compared to many other species that are out there. We don't run that fast. We don't have the greatest eyesight. We're not really that strong compared to many other animals. We're susceptible to all kinds of diseases. We eat plants that can be poisonous. The fact that we have survived, despite all of these assaults that have befallen us for the millennia, is because there are people with enough unique features that they can survive anything. So we know, for example, that sickle cell anemia, which happened because of some random mutation in some person in sub-Saharan Africa, made that person immune to the mosquito that transmits malaria. And so sickle cell anemia is thought to have been something that arose as a random event in the life development of some infant that led that individual to be immune to malaria, which made it possible for that individual to pass that gene on. And that's a lot of how human evolution through the many millennia occurs. So there's clearly differences in human beings across this planet. And these differences, which are to a great degree in the DNA of our genome, there are obviously environmental differences, there are social differences, there are, you know, cultural differences, but it all starts with these genetic differences. Genes are the egg, they're not the chicken. They're what starts things going. They are the blueprint by which every cell in your body decides how to grow up and live in the community of other cells in your body. They make every organ, they make, you know, all these individual characteristics that people have. Everybody has good things about their genome that make them strong and resilient. Everybody has some things about their genome that they wish they didn't have in their genome that makes them susceptible to certain illnesses. And so this is, and you know, as Kath said, the great frontier of 21st century medicine, which has been called by President Obama precision to personalized medicine, is to take advantage of these individual differences and improve human health as a result of it.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about this idea of pseudoscience, right? And I think there are several elements, and it's fun sort of saying this in front of everybody as you're, you know, the person who's responsible for training you, what pseudoscience is, right? So I think the first problem with pseudoscience is the question that we start off with, and I'll sort of push this into the frame of the scientific method. So it's a question or the set of assumptions that one starts off with, and those questions and set of assumptions come from the biases that exist amongst those that ask the questions. It's one of the reasons why the idea of training the next generation and thinking about bringing a diverse set of perspectives to the group of scientists that we're training as part of this initiative is so fundamental from the very beginning. Even as we're thinking about the sciences, we're thinking about how do we make sure postdocs and grad students and other folks of diverse perspectives and experiences are participating in the science as well, because that is sort of some of the critical guards against the pseudoscience that might come out of the other side, right? And, you know, Dr. Rev Al doesn't, you know, he sort of says he's going to defer to the scientist, but in this case, he is also part of the scientific inquiry, right? So guarding against that idea of pseudoscience, the first thing that's necessary is to really think about the individual or the set of individuals asking the question and having the community involved from the very beginning. The second thing that's critical is it's always important to keep in mind that when you've framed your question, that your sampling has to be broad enough to essentially try to really disprove yourself. So what happens is, there's a class of medical illnesses, for example, that give you bones that are easy to break and a blue haze around your eyes, right? And so if your sample is small enough, you could do a scientific experiment and you'd say, well, are blue eyes correlated or linked to brittle bones, right? And if, on the one hand, you had those with disease that had hazes of blue, haze around their blue eyes and brittle bones. And on the other hand, you have nobody with brittle bones and nobody with blue eyes. You'd say, of course, blue eyes are linked to brittle bones, right? And because blue eyes are linked to brittle bones, anybody with blue eyes is not going to thrive in society. And perhaps we should have less people with blue eyes in society because it's really bad for brittle bones, right? Because you sampled in that population something that was based on an original hypothesis, which ultimately ends up being pseudoscience once you generate policy as a result of it, right? So there are entire enterprises of science historically that start off with a group of people asking a set of biased questions and then sub-selecting and repeatedly subsetting and throwing out data until they have something that supports the idea that they already started off with for the policy they wanted to generate, right? Which is very different than what we're starting off with. What we're starting off with is saying, human beings are biological organisms. Part of what human beings experience as biological organisms is coded in DNA. That DNA somehow has to match with environment. So we're not throwing out the issue in environment here. It's a core feature of what is expressed when we talk about mental illness. But at the same time, ancestry, which is one of the key hallmarks of how your DNA is passed down across generations, is a key feature of the organization of biology as well. And by keeping all of that in mind, that is our hypothesis, right? We sort of are open to anyone coming in if they want to argue against that hypothesis or disprove it. We're willing to contend in the scientific enterprise around that, right? And then build a team that, as a group of scientists that are linked with community, investigates the health impacts of that, right? That's how we avoid pseudoscience, but it's something that we always have to be mindful of. And we always have to guard against the idea that the data we're generating and our ability to bring the community in can be used as a weapon for pseudoscience, which is why it's so important to have surveillance of the data, to have community involved, to have public engagement, right? Panels like we're doing like this are so critical for making sure as the data is being generated, we're making sure who owns it and we're thinking about how it's interpreted.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to my next question, is talking about that level of who's asking the question and also how that's resulted to a lot of medical mistrust. So in the article, you've highlighted the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the hysterectomy or the sterilization of Black and Latino women, and the unethical extraction of Henrietta Lacks cells that are still in use today, which have revolutionized science as we know it. So can you actually give some insight to where you first learned about medical abuse, like which case it was? And then also a second question is, you've talked about building this rapport with the community and this collaboration with Rev Hathaway, but like, what does this actually look like on the ground of trying to rectify the past, even if it wasn't you individually, but as science and medicine as a whole?
Yep. So let me take the first part, and then I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Rev Al. So yeah, I'm sitting at Hopkins. I'm sitting there with Dr. Weinberger. He's telling me about this initiative, and I'm like, so we're just going to sit here at Hopkins, and you're going to tell me about how you're taking Black brains, right? Like, are we just going to act like it wasn't right there? Like, we're not going to do that, right? Right. And so I'm just like, okay. Yeah, okay, yeah, sure, we're gonna do this thing. And so like immediately I got off, I'm like Googling like Rev Al, like I find the email address, because I gotta talk to Rev Al, right? Like I'm all for this, but like if the community is involved, I need to understand like how the community is involved, how they're thinking about it, what role have they played about drugs, how's this going to be communicated to the broader community, what are his motivations there, how are we going to make sure in the long run that this works, right? What I'm not interested in is generating a genomic database that somebody's going to monetize, that's going to flow money outside the community, and while Baltimore as a city is suffering from depression and drug abuse and all of the things that have been inflicted on a community that's been forgotten over time, right? That their data and information are now generating resources for somebody else. So that was something that was primary for me. And it's primary for me because I understand that's exactly what happened with Henrietta Lacks, right? So the tissue that was taken without her consent, ultimately people figured out how to monetize it and create incredible companies that made medical innovations. And if this was done the appropriate way, those resources should have been flowing back into Baltimore City, right? And the literacy rate should have been different, and there shouldn't have been lead in the paint in the walls that the kids were growing up and experiencing, right? So this was a primary thing that I had to understand, and I needed to hear about that from Reverend Al. So I'll toss it over to him.
Yeah, one of the blessings of being in the faith community is that I had the opportunity to circulate among a number of persons. I had a very good friend of mine, who's an older friend, who uncle had been actually one of the persons in the Tuskegee experiment. She went to Tuskegee herself. She's passed Sister Maggie Quill, and she was getting a check. And she would come call me up and say, hey, Rev, can you take me to the bank? I got this check. I want to make a deposit. And I said, well, where'd that come from? She said, it's the proceeds from the experiment of Tuskegee of my uncle. And it heightened my attention then that this is very real. This is not something distant that happened somewhere in the past. This is something that has actually happened that affected people that I knew and that I loved. And so I went with that kind of suspicion when I first interacted with the Lieber Institute. And I said to them quite clearly that I wanted to make certain that as we walked every step of the way, there was diversity through every aspect of this inquiry. I wanted to make certain that there were technicians, there were principal investigators, there were researchers, and even the investment of capital. I wanted to make certain that that was from a diverse body of people as well. In my mind, that was the way to ensure that we had accountability. Also was a way to ensure we had credibility, also the way to ensure that we had transparency. Want to make certain that we brought the best minds into this pursuit of truth early on. That's what led me to have the conversation with Morgan State University so that we could build them into this process. And in fact, we need to bring them in at some point in time. They are now pursuing the approval for a master's degree in neuroscience, which is just a tremendous contribution that we will have people of color intimately integrated into this process as we develop it. My perspective from the standpoint of advocacy is that my antenna has to be very high at all times of anything and any sense of injustice. So I bring to the table, this doesn't seem right. Now, the fortunate piece has been I've had amenable relationships with Danny Weinberger and Lieber that we hadn't had that kind of tension. They understand that we want to do this correctly and began to reach out to Dr. Hurd, to Dr. James Gilbreth at Meharry, and we began to reach out to all of these different subject matter experts, Dr. Young at Morgan, to bring them into the process with their critical analysis. I think that is the secret sauce in what we're doing. We're bringing the best minds of diverse backgrounds into this conversation, into this pursuit, in its initial stages. I think that's how you guard against some of the problems we've had in the past.
I must say, I think from the point of view of the scientists at the Lieber Institute, this is the critical feature that gives us confidence that we're not going to go down a path that will end up being misunderstood, abused, or in any way misrepresented. I mean, our goal is very much to understand the science of, human ancestry. which will have payoff not just for the individuals that we study, but for people all over this planet. You know, one of the things that Reverend Al and I talked a lot about, and we had a number of meetings, and we met with the folks at Morgan State, we met with people at University of Maryland. It's you know, as Kath said, I mean, race is a social construct. Ancestry is part of the biology of human evolution and human history. And, you know, we know that something like, you know, Africa was the birthplace of all life on this planet. Plant life, animal life, human life, it all emerged from Africa. And there were many forms of humans that left Africa over hundreds of thousands of years. But there was one group that left about 40,000 years ago that became modern humans all over the world outside of Africa. But they came from Africa. Africa was the ancestral genome of these people. And these are the people that populated the rest of the world. You know, I like to make the comment that whatever encouraged them to leave, cross the desert, endure whatever was necessary to endure. And it's thought that was about a clan of about 1,500 people. They probably didn't leave because they ran things. You know, they probably left because they were kicked out in some way. And, you know, they changed over these thousands and thousands of years. They weren't white people when they left. This is many, many generations that have changed. And understanding this ancestry is something that's critical for us to be able to solve many of the puzzles of human illness, because these are the founding people of this planet. And this, I think, is an enlightening perspective, because it takes this concept of race out of the discussion. And it is about human beings, how human beings traveled, changed over time, and took on different characteristics. You know, people talk about one of the characteristics that probably selected for lighter skin color was in these Scandinavian countries where there's very little sunlight, that vitamin D, which is critical for human health, needs sunlight to be made in your skin. And if there's too much melanin, you won't be able to get that to happen. So these are how, you know, over time, human features change because the environments give one reason or another to what we call select for them. But I think this is really how we understand human ancestry and how it translates into these different features of human beings. And this is not about good, bad, or in any way a valued statement. It's just trying to understand where people come from and how they have these individual characteristics that make them who they are.
A common and very true statement that's been said in both this discussion and the panel before was race is a social construct, whereas the effects of racism actually hold true in society and affect people's health differently. So I actually want to bring up a recent article that was published in PLOS Biology that was quantifying social media engagement with scientific articles. And these are the authors, Carlson and Harris, reported that actually white nationalists and white ring extremists engage most with preprints about genetics and about neuroscientists, or about neuroscience, because they're often using those to reinforce pseudoscience or eugenic rhetorics about, oh, people are different or race is biological. So how should the scientific community actually engage with social media or science communication with the work that you're doing now, specifically with African ancestry and genetic diversity, to ensure that like the way that the data and the results are being interpreted is what you intended?
Let me start by tackling that, and I'll throw it more broadly. First of all, I don't think we as scientists do enough job around science communication and public engagement, right? We have somehow become convinced that our ideas exist in this closed off architecture where it's a free exchange of ideas with our colleagues who have the same shared of biases in the way they think about the world. And then out of the other end comes magical science that's then ready for public consumption. And the notion of preprints, which your early thoughts are shared more broadly, has changed everything. It's changed the whole landscape, right? And nowhere is that more clear than if you even think about what's going on with COVID, where preprints change entire populations' behaviors before they've even gone through the scientific process. So first of all, I think it's really important for us as scientists, having heard that evidence that people are picking up preprints and building word views around our preprints, we have to understand that as we're creating and getting prepared to present the science to our colleagues, whether it's online or in Twitter or in a preprint, it has to say, this is not what this science is saying, right? And I would put that in the abstract introduction, right? We have to operate as if we are putting ideas into the world that will be consumed for purposes that are problematic. And we have to say that that's not what this is, right? So we have to have a greater appreciation for the audience on the other side of our work at every step that we take, right? So we have been doing things, whether it's in meeting with newspapers or NPR, reliably and repeatedly framing what is going to come out of the other end with the data, right? And when that preprint is available, it will capture that exact same framing, right? It will say, this is not what this is, right? We are talking about ancestry. We're not talking about, it doesn't justify thinking about racism or race or racism in this way. This is what it says, but it's really important for the language to be clear about that, right? Even as we were pulling together the original piece for Neuron, articulating the vision, it's why it is spelled out in that way, right? It talks about, one can make the case and say, yes, people of African ancestry tend to participate in studies less, right? And that has a cascading effect. It must be paired with bad things have been done to Black people in this country for health purposes since the very beginning. And the natural outcome of that is I'm not going to be first in line for X to be done to me, right? And so unless there is a building of a relationship and repairing of trust, the outcome of participation in science hasn't happened. But so the narrative around under-participation has to be immediately paired with the reason for that, and it's a historical deficit and it's racism. So I think in everything that we try to do, it's important for us to realize that the audience on the other side may not be aware of all that history. So we have to present data and context with the history simultaneously, all of the time, every single time, repeatedly and reliably.
Yeah, I would say that we have been very intentional to make certain that as we present this, it had that construct, so that's where there's a whole body of public TV, radio, newsprint, articles, journal articles. All of that has happened largely because I stepped to the plate saying our community must be informed about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And they need to have the opportunity to be able to give us feedback. That's why there is a public process attached to what we're doing. And I think that that's a healthy dialogue. If you think about it, most times a scientist goes into their lab, they work in their lab, they hunker down, they're pursuing questions as they look through different analysis, they then emerge with an aha moment. Well, I believe the community can participate in the hunkering down process as well and can help you discover that aha moment. And then you have community buy-in because we all end up at the same place with the same kind of wrestling of dynamics. And that's what has been, I think, a unique aspect of our process has been that we've brought to the table the community, other stakeholders, other interests, so that when the scientist goes to do their tedious work, they're not by themselves. They realize that they're surrounded by collaborative spirits that are not only cheering them on, but critiquing and ensuring that they stay the course.
Yeah, I don't think Dr. Rev Al is being forthcoming enough on the full role of that he's played and how he talks about investments, right? So I'll tell you, man, like there are a couple of stories and exchanges that we had that blew me away, right? So when we're talking about financial investments and philanthropists, right? It's Rev Al who was working with the folks on the Hill, right, to get national investments around it. It's Rev Al that went to Maryland's governor. Right, it's Rev Al who, through another social philanthropist and an investor in Baltimore, invested the first 7 figures. Right, so like, and that's a man of African ancestry, so it's a Black man. So I think it's really important for people to hear that part of the story, right, and that part of the advocacy, because even in the launching of that initiative, there's some biases that clearly need to be written. I'll tell you, even as we were talking, when I was talking about his investment group, he's like, yeah, we went down the building to see who was renting it, and there was a Lieber in the building that we were renting out to them, right? I love to hear those things, right? Because it flips the whole thing on its head, and you realize that this initiative has the opportunity to counter so many narratives about how science is done, about who it's done for, and ultimately how we can use that to uplift an entire community, right? So this is, I think this project for me, why I had to be involved, it was a masterclass in science communication, community engagement, this is how it should be done.
So following up with that point about the financial investments and how science has to be done, many experiments, clinical trials, and technologies don't consider Black people or people of African ancestry in the preliminary stages of designing these. So a good example is with electroencephalograms and the limitation of Black hairstyles. So let's say me right now with my current hair, I couldn't go and get an EEG done today. So like, what are some of those things that you're doing? Because this is also involving people of African ancestry's participation in these experiments in clinical trials, especially with neuroscience. So even if you combat the medical mistrust or the accessibility to research, then there's that whole technological or lack of financial support for research.
I'll take the first piece and then I'll pass it to Danny. Danny, let me just take.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first investment in our work came from a very benevolent foundation in Baltimore that really put the first $275,000 in there. The president and myself had been friends and colleagues for many years, and he placed it in there with this one caveat. Rev Al, I want you to make certain that the advocates for Black Lives Matter and empowerment have an opportunity to weigh in on what you're doing. So in the whole design, it was that whole array of voices should have the opportunity to participate in this conversation and dialogue. And as we have structured it, we structured it in a way, and Dr. Gerazi's been kind. I do have some market presence. The church that I serve is of a little bit more, it's a step above a storefront. And people connect to me and they communicate with me and I'm able to communicate with them. And that credibility is of value as we move down the road. So one of the things in this that really was not a barrier is that inside of Lieber's collection of brain tissue matter, they already had that process built in. So it wasn't a matter of having to go and talk to people about being donors. That was a hurdle that in this instance we didn't have to cross. And they already had a process by which they received donors that had been vetted, that was recognizable, had protocols, And once we were assured of that, it was comfortable then to be engaged. And I think Dr. Weinberger can speak to that more directly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, apropos of this whole conversation about transparency, I think what's really unique about this initiative compared to many other big science projects is it's a ground up operation that really the community has been there from day one. And every step that's being taken is taken together with the community partners. Also, the science is going to be and is being monitored very carefully by a scientific advisory committee. And Dr. Zarasa and Yasmin Hurd, who's professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, New York, are the chairs of our scientific advisory council. So the science is not just a bunch of Lieber Institute scientists running off in a corner doing what they think they should be doing. It's very closely linked with the Scientific Advisory Council. So again, this is a project that is meant to have value to the public health of this community because it has not been adequately served by the scientific research community. And so we believe that this will have enormous value, but it's not going to go anywhere without the community being at its side every step of the way. Has to be that way. Otherwise, because trust is critical. And I think, you asked the question of how does the information, and I think Kath spoke to this very nicely, how does the information not get abused? I mean, obviously, we are not going to be able to stop every white supremacist group from misquoting and misrepresenting the results of these data. But I think because the community is going to be spreading the word about what the importance of this is, and there will be scientific achievements that improve the health of people, I think this will ultimately, be the message that gets out.
Could I also just say, and I will touch on what Dr. Razi and Dr. Weinberger just said. In this process, the community, vis-a-vis in terms of my responsibility, has been the primary raiser of funds. And that gives you place at the table. So not only the first $275,000 the community raised, we raised $1.25 million, $1.25 million from the governor of the state of Maryland. As was mentioned, we had a very well-endowed African-American philanthropist give another $1 million. And then the work that we did inside of Capitol Hill was having our senators, both our senior senator, Senator Cardin, and then our junior Senator Van Hollen, who sat on the Appropriations Committee. I went to a colleague of mine who is the president of the National Broadcasters Association, whose cousin is also on the Senate Appropriations Committee, who happened to be a Republican, and they got together. And then the next thing you know, they were able to place language inside of the last budget that allowed for us to potentially access about $21 million. Now, in most instances, it's the researcher who responds to a RFP or some kind of notice of a funding availability that then responds. In this instance, it was the community driving the acquisition of capital to be invested in this process, which I think gives it a level of transparency, because we have to be accountable to those for whom made the investments. And then the researchers and scientists have to be accountable to us, who therefore are accountable to the investors in the process. I think it's a different means of funding from what you traditionally think of in terms of research.
Yeah,
and we're about 5 minutes out, so I'm just going to ask one last question before we wrap up. So this had to do with the statistical challenge that you spoke about in the article about how it's going to take a lot of work to analyze this complex data set of the genetic diversity present in African ancestry. So what are the best practices for building these statistical models that capture all of these different factors that intersect with race or racism? So this could be things like stress or the neighborhoods that people are living, the access in healthcare. So how are you building this statistical model so that you're still capturing what's actually happening, but also still looking at all of the things that are risk or maybe neuroprotective factors, how do you actually go about that from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, so let me say a little bit of something from the question before and then dovetail it into this, right? So this is a neuroracism panel. So as you know, everybody out there in webinar land realizes we are currently in the middle of a brain initiative, right? Where the goal is to understand the human brain and all of its complexities. And one of the phases of that is going to be building a human cell atlas. And so as we build a cell atlas, this is the 200 billion cells in the brain, each with their own sort of gene expression profile. One of the challenges is going to make sure that that brain atlas is representative of humanity and not just like we talked about the genomic databases of a European ancestry. Right? It would be absurd if we made a human cell atlas that was a male brain or not a female brain, right? You can immediately appreciate all of those challenges. But things have happened in the past where we've developed medicines and interventions that work better in men or more primarily in men than in women. To combat that, it's important for the voice to be in the room. Right. And I can say this to you so clearly. This is why it's important for you to finish your PhD and tell people the leads for the EEG do not work with your hair. Right. It's why we're thinking so clearly about training. And over time, we'll come back and hopefully talk to you about how we've extended this to more HBCUs and minority serving institutions and figure out how to link postdoc trainees into it. But more people have to be in the room to raise these issues. Right. The issue about scale and scope of the genomics that we're going to have to navigate through, it's complex, right? We know that environment changes the brain. There's no doubt about it, right? The brain is an organ that optimizes the function of human beings within environment. And those environmental variables lead to epigenetic changes, some of which are passed down across generations, it turns out. Shout out to some of my brilliant colleagues doing that work. But it means that we need people asking the exact questions that you're asking. They have to build into our models. And these are extremely interdisciplinary questions that we need to be wrestling with, right? For me to say, here's the answer, here's a simple way to do it, means I haven't thought earnestly about the problem, right? Like we actually need a team of scientists at population level scale. We need all of y'all out there and all of your friends to be thinking about this question as we move it forward. So that's why we need you to finish your PhD. That's why I mess with you. That's why I push you so hard. So do what you got to do.
That is exactly the right answer. We need more Gwinnells. That's exactly the right answer.
Yep.
That's what it will take.
Don't cry, Gwen. It'll be okay.
That's exactly what it
And
will
keep in
take.
mind, you got Rev Al praying for you and cheering you on.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for all of the contributions today. And we really appreciate the discussion on neuroracism. And we will all publish the paper on Twitter in case people didn't get a chance to interact. So thank you so much. And that's our panel for today.
Thanks,
Great job, Gwen.
Good to see you.
Great job, Gwen. Great job. I'm proud of you.